Chapter 5 Hedgehogs and Unicorns. Although the herb gatherers were growing more or less familiar with plants and roots, because they were needed for medicine, much less intelligence was used with regard to animals. Deer and rabbits were shot for food, horses and dogs were tamed, and hawks were trained for hunting birds. A few other common animals were known, but in general a feeling of fear and mystery surrounded the wild animals. Sometimes, to be sure, the schoolmen discussed animals and quoted learned authorities to reinforce their arguments. The question of how many teeth were in a horse's mouth was debated with great heat in many learned circles. Solemn books were written on this subject, with references to other learned books, but no one thought to open a horse's mouth and count its teeth, for this was the age when learning looked to authority. Progress is not made by having one learned authority quote another, and it is not strange that no original works on zoology were produced in the early Middle Ages. There was, however, one book on animals that was read everywhere, a book so curious and so widely known that it must be considered here, though it certainly cannot be said it is in any way scientific. The book is called Physiologus, and no one knows who wrote it, but it probably had a number of authors. It is a collection of stories about animals. Such a book was called a bestiary. Each story has a moral attached to it and is intended to describe the habits of the animal and also set forth the teachings of the church. The Physiologus was enormously popular. The stories were translated into Icelandic and Ethiopian, and they were read and recited by popes and friars, taught in universities, and told at almost every fireside. They were copied by monks, and every monastery had a book on them. The animals of the story were carved in the choirs and chancels of churches and cathedrals. There was no one in Europe in the Middle Ages who did not know Physiologus. It must be admitted that these animals had lively personalities. Some of them were familiar ones that everybody had seen or knew about. Some were more exotic, creatures that lived in distant lands and so were seldom seen. No one had ever met with some of them, but everyone believed that they existed. Just as the herbalists thought that every plant that grew held either a blessing or an evil omen for mankind, so it was with the animals according to this book. So Physiologus says of the hedgehog, an animal that must have been familiar to the peasants of northern Europe, quote, "He is a small beast, shaped like a bull, entirely set round with prickles. He procures his nourishment in this way. He goes to a vine, reaches down to the clusters, tears off the grapes, and casts them on the ground. Then he throws himself down, and the grapes fasten to his prickles, and he brings them home to his children, and leaves the clusters empty on the vine. The hole in which the hedgehog lives is provided with two openings and is bored with air holes. And when the north wind begins to blow, he stops the opening with its which is turned to the north wind. But when the south wind blows, he stops the opening which is turned to the south wind and opens the north hole which he before had stopped." Unquote. Stories told of the fox, which, quote, "is a very crafty animal. He casts himself on his back and holds his breath and swells up his body completely so that he appears dead. The birds believe that he is really dead, and they fly down to him in order to eat him up, but he springs up and catches them and eats them up." Unquote. And of the whale, Physiologus says, quote, "There is a great monster in the sea called the whale. He has two attributes. His first attribute is this: when he is hungry, he opens wide his jaws, and therefrom streams a very sweet savor. And all the little fishes gather themselves in heaps and shoals around the whale's mouth, and it laps them up. But the big and full-grown fishes keep away from him. The other attribute of the whale is as follows: the monster is very large, just like an island. Now the sailors in their ignorance moor their boat to him as to the shore of an island. They make a fire thereon to cook their meal, And when the monster feels the heat, then he dives down into the depths of the sea and carries the boat with him, men and mouse. Unquote. Here's the woodpecker. Quote, a gay-colored bird who gets up into the trees and pecks at them with his beak and listens with his ear. Unquote. The peacock. Quote, he is of beautiful color and lordly plumage. When he passes by, he looks at himself and rejoices much over himself. He shakes himself, turns a somersault, and looks proudly around. Unquote. Later, if you turn the pages, you will read about the eagle who, quote, when he is aging, his flight grows heavy and his eyesight dim. What does he do now? He seeks first a pure spring water and flies aloft to the ether of the sun and burns off his old feathers and loosens the film over his eyes and flees down to the spring and therein dives 3 times under and becomes young again. Unquote. And then there is the snake. Quote, when it goes to the stream to drink, it carries not its poison with it, but leaves it behind in its hole. Unquote. And the less familiar lion, who, when it is pursued by the hunter, brushes away its tracks behind with its tail, and the tiger, who rolls its young before it inside a glass ball. Of all the descriptions of animals in the Physiologus, the one that might have disturbed Aristotle most was that of the sea urchin, for he knew the sea creatures well. Physiologus says this of the sea urchin, quote, that which happens in the sea is beyond all speech and understanding. I have heard from one who lives on the coast that the sea urchin is a little and contemptible beast which lives in the sea and which tells the sailor whether the waves will be calm or rough. For this urchin seeks the rock whereon he hangs and clings, and he fastens himself to it as to an anchor, so that the waves, though they toss him here and there and up and down, cannot tear him away. And this he does as though he were minded to point out beforehand the oncoming storm, the tumult of which is already in his mind. As soon as the sailors see him, they know by this sign that danger threatens them from the violence of the wind. There is no Chaldean, no mathematician who can read in the course of the stars what the movements of the winds will be. Who has taught this urchin, the stupid little beast? Who but the Lord himself? Unquote. It was not hard for the men who read these descriptions of familiar or little-known animals to take a step further and believe in animals which no one had ever seen. So Physiologus describes the antlion, with the head of a lion and the body of an enormous ant. It always starved to death because the head wanted to eat meat and the body wanted to be fed grass. And there was the cockatrice, a deadly little serpent with the head of a cock and the body of a snake. One had but to see it to die, and the only way to defend oneself against it was to sew mirrors to one's garments so that it might see its own image first. Later, he tells of the phoenix, the Arabian bird which at the end of a certain number of years made its nest of spices, sang a melodious dirge, flapped its wings to set fire to the pile, burned itself to ashes, and came forth in new life. There were also the griffin, the dragon, the winged horse, and, most popular of all, the unicorn. The unicorn was a beautiful creature, wild and shy and very fleet of foot. He was pure white, the Physiologus said, but on his forehead he bore a single horn, 1½ cubits, about 2 feet in length, colored red, black, and white. A drinking cup made from this horn would protect you against poison. For many centuries in Europe, people believed in these unseen animals quite as faithfully as in the wild creatures they had seen. There was nothing extraordinary about this. After all, there were so many things in the world then that men had not explored. At least that was true for the great majority of people. There were, of course, a few who wanted to prove facts. One of those was Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, who was Holy Roman Emperor in the 13th century. Half Oriental in his habits and in his way of thinking, he gathered a group of learned men from both East and West about him in his court. He established a school of medicine at Salerno, where, for the first time since Alexandrian days, human bodies were dissected. He had the writings of Aristotle translated from Greek to Latin and wrote a book on falconry, in which he described the anatomy and habits of birds from actual observation. All these things were efforts at scientific method and bold ventures in his day, but at Frederick II's death they were ignored and forgotten, for his work was not in accord with the temper of his times. There were other men here and there who also made efforts at original work. Albertus Magnus in the 13th century spent his life in editing the writings of Aristotle, and Roger Bacon tried doing actual scientific experiments, but he was imprisoned, for people thought he was dabbling in magic. The great mass of people continued to believe in the stories of hedgehogs and unicorns that were written in the Physiologus, not knowing that already the winds of change were blowing.